to introduce Moises Norena, who for 6 years, come on up, Moises. Let's have a hand. So have a seat, Moises. Okay. We're going to sit here. For 6 years, Moises was Whirlpool's global director of innovation. So he saw this whole story, this decade-long journey unfold. He is now the global leader of strategic innovation at Allstate, the insurance company in Chicago. And I'll just give you one heads up. If you want to go deeper, which I'm sure you're going to want to, Moises is one of the most prolific and thoughtful contributors to the mix. There's several very deep stories there about what Whirlpool has done, and they're also among the most liked and retweeted on the mix. So there's a lot of material there. So come and sit over here, Moises. I don't want to be so far away from. So let me just start with a question. So we're going to get into a bit of the journey and what happened, but maybe a couple of questions to start with. What difference has all this made? You know, if I'm CEO, if I'm the shareholders of Whirlpool, what difference has all this work over a decade actually made to the company's performance?
Well, I think there are different ways to look at that. Number one, I think if everyone looks at the stock, you can see where it has come from and where it is today. I think that's a key indication.
It's going up, I assume.
It keeps going up.
Yeah, okay,
yep,
good.
It keeps going up. Actually, it's the most growth last year. I think the stock that has the largest growth in the F500.
Hope you were invested.
Yep,
okay.
Yep. But I think if you go back to when we started this journey, and you look at the appliance industry, and what how we're competing on, really have changed the rules of the game in terms of how we focus on the consumer and really creating demand versus pushing product into the consumer. I think that's the biggest change. And new categories like Gladiator in the garage, brand new brand.
What is this?
Gladiator in the
Gladiator
garage.
Rogers,
yep.
Okay.
And also bringing some of the most commoditized products like washers and dryers to become things that people really want. And with that, increasing the average price of those products for the company or from the industry.
So I heard, and you can tell me whether this is true, it's probably slightly mangled, but I heard that when you guys started, if somebody had a refrigerator, or had a washer, let's say, that wasn't working, and you wanted to replace it, there was only about 10% chance that you would replace the other appliance, the dryer, at the same time. Mm-hmm. And with you guys reinventing the design language of appliances, you changed that number a little bit. Is that true?
Yeah, that's a great example. A technical term is we increase the attachment ratio. And we gave reasons to people to do that. If you think about, why would you change that? It looks the same. It doesn't do anything different. When you think about now the front loaders with colors, something that you really want to be in a prominent place in your home, you now have a reason to do that and actually feel proud about it. So that's a great example of how we're creating demand.
So let me ask then maybe a deeper question. So if you look at all these organizations around the world who, at least at some level, say they take innovation seriously, but you look at, they are not creating category-defining products. They are not changing the margin structures in their business. Most people do not feel they are accountable for innovation. What are most organizations still missing? We'll come back to your whole story, but okay. Let's start with like the punchline. What are the 3 or 4 things that you think Whirlpool did very well that most companies still haven't really grokked?
I think there is probably one thing that is the most important one, and is that we looked at that as a system. Had a systematic approach of doing that. It was not one program, let's train a bunch of people and see what happens. Or let's do a big project and see if that category races to the top. It was really about taking a systematic approach and making a business process out of innovation. It's part of the language of the leadership. It's part of the enterprise planning cycle. It's part of the everyday operations of the business, and that's what I think really has changed.
Now, when you say, let's take this one at a time. When you say it's kind of systemic, what do you mean by that? What does it mean? I mean, what are the pieces of this system that you had to engineer or work on?
We talk about that in terms of management systems. So you can think of different dimensions within that management framework. With at the center really having a key connection to the strategy. Really having a reason to innovate and giving the business a clarity on what is it that we want to accomplish with that. Along with those lines, then we defined what that meant and gave people understanding of what it meant to drive innovation, because it's very easy to say, I have a gadget, or I have this real innovation. How do you differentiate and then measure that? So that leads me to another important topic, which is measuring innovation from a system perspective, inputs, process metrics and outputs, and we can talk about those later if you'd like. Giving incentives to people to innovate across the organization in the business unit, not a group that does innovation. And and when you think about, you have these leadership planning meetings and so on, inserting innovation conversations in that process all the time. So those are examples of things that we did. I think the most important thing is that we were consistent through that, consistent over time. People kept at it, we kept raising the bar as far as the innovation goals and the people that had to be trained in how to do portfolio management and so on.
So why is it that so I know so for number one, you looked at it systemically. So you looked, if I can say, maybe I'm wrong on this, but you kind of, like a company would re-engineer its operating model for efficiency, you were re-engineering your management processes for innovation. Is that a fair way?
That's a fair way to say it, yep.
So why do most companies miss that? Why don't they take a more systemic view of this problem? Do you have any hypotheses?
I think what plays into that is the lack of clear definition of what they want to accomplish with innovation, number one. But I think it's also important to know where you place the people that are taking these decisions. And that's something that probably has been missed in many companies. The CEO may say to all his direct staff, well, go innovate and do it, and you can proliferate innovation across the organization, but there's no one that is architecting that effort. And at Whirlpool, it has been very consistent over time to have one person architecting that, having discussions with leadership at management system levels that, to some extent are invisible to people, but that actually create that engine that is well-oiled to drive innovation.
So you have not just a CTO or a head of R&D, but you have somebody who is responsible for making innovation a competence and is looking at it through that lens.
Yep.
Yeah. So besides not thinking of it as a systemic whole, what other 2 or 3 things would you say most companies have missed if they've tried to, become more serious about innovation?
I think something that you rarely see is having a very distinct innovation definition that then translates into the metrics that are consistent over time. So I think that element and having clarity on that is key to the success. Otherwise, all the conversations keep the leadership unsatisfied about what's happening, and you don't have clarity on, okay, are we accomplishing what we need? And I think another important aspect is to create a consistent language on a process perspective. And something that Whirlpool was very focused on training thousands of people on what the innovation process was. How do you change the mindset of incrementality to really think differently and cover through lenses, orthodoxies, and so on and so forth, that over time, that creates a common language in the organization. And you can have leaders understand what the teams are doing. That's another thing that I very commonly see, that you have teams at ground level executing, but leadership doesn't understand what's going on. And there is no connection in the conversations.
So let's pick those apart for a moment. So you said starting with a definition. I think that's very interesting because certainly most organizations I go in, if you ask people across the organization, what does innovation mean? You get 100 different answers, as many as people. So how did Whirlpool get to a shared definition, and what is it?
That was a leadership discussion, and the realization of the need of the definition came from the scaling mechanisms necessary to get innovation across the globe. So as we started to make inroads and needed to make sure that everyone around the globe was delivering innovations and we attached compensation of leaders to their success, we needed to have clarity on what we meant by innovation. So the leadership team discussed what we wanted to accomplish, and that delivered the definition. The definition, it's been very consistent over time. That's another thing that I think is very important. It has 3 elements. The first one is, which I think it's something that everybody...
And maybe give us an example of each where Whirlpool's innovated against that criteria.
Yeah, that's great. So if you think of unique and compelling solutions that match or align with the brands and competencies of the company, I think that's the most common part of the innovation. We say something unique. When we say something that consumers want, we have a way to prove that. The second element was that we needed to have sustainable competitive advantage. It's not a one-time effort. We need to develop either a way to create barriers of entry or be fast enough with migration paths that would over time grow that idea. And the third element of the definition, which is as important as the others, is that this was done to create shareholder value. And we made a choice, and the choice was that it had to have differentiated shareholder value, which could be measurable. So when we think about examples of innovation, when you think about the core categories of Whirlpool, and think of one of the new categories that was created was called 1, 2, 3. So washing is 1, drying is 2nd, and 3 was everything else. Pedestals and surfaces and things in the closets to organize your laundry room. That's unique because it addressed a need that hadn't been addressed before. I think that's the most evident thing. You raise the washer to an ergonomic level, just basically creating a category that didn't exist before. It had a migration path. There were a number of things that over time would not allow competition to catch up. So
it's not just a one-off idea. You're asking people, what's the migration? What's next? What's the next idea? So you really are backing things that you see are going to be a family of innovations. Absolutely. Rather than a one-off.
So what is the domain that we're trying to address, and what is the underlying need that the consumer has in this space? And I don't think it, in this case, has been solved. All the different things that we do after washing and dryer continue to be issues for consumers, so that's still a very latent need. But we've made great progress on that. And then the third element was, does it deliver shareholder value? In that case, we're looking at against a core category, which is washers and dryers, and we'll take a look at the EOP that this category is delivering and had to deliver against a threshold that is higher than the base business. So a very concrete way of measuring whether it's delivering that in that dimension.
So can people, is that definition now nuanced enough? Because at one level, that sounds like all logical. It has to it has to change customer expectations. It has to be something that's sustainable and we can build on, and it has to create real value. But is that definition nuanced enough now so people can start to kind of self-edit their ideas? Because what I often see when organizations open up this conversation about innovation, they're actually quite disappointed because a lot of the ideas are basically garbage. Yeah. And they go like, hey, we told you people didn't have any ideas. So has this helped people to improve the quality, do you think?
I think so, and this becomes a habit over time. As we were scaling innovation across the globe, and we said, okay, how do we get the definition so everybody knows it, everyone knows what to do with it? We created one document, that it can be found in the Mix article called the iBox. And,
iBox.
iBox, the innovation box. Basically goes through all the different elements of the definition in more granularity and allows the innovators across the company to look at each one of those elements and say, am I delivering against the definition? Now, at some point, that might be cumbersome. People may say, that's a lot of work. What will have people feel that? In fact, that could be an enemy of innovation if you have people wasting time filling forms. But the reality is that those three elements, if you're doing your job as an innovator through an innovation process, you have all the answers. It's not that you have to sit and build that. That's in essence what an innovation project through this process delivers. Come up with the new ideas, measure how is it going to be sustainable, create a migration path. So, it's just.
So you've kind of embedded that thinking and that model. You would say, how of Whirlpool's 100,000 employees, how many do you think would understand that basic idea of innovation?
Well, you have a lot of people in factories and so on, but I think everyone, in the headquarters and in product development teams and engineering will understand that.
So let me ask a follow-up then. You said that, obviously if you don't have a definition, you can't really hold people accountable for delivering it because you don't know how to measure it. And then you said metrics. My sense is very few organizations have innovation metrics that really everyone is accountable for. So tell me a little bit about how do you put some kind of
rigor and
around this idea. I mean, how do you actually hold an average middle level or senior manager responsible for innovation? We've gone back and forth several times through this process, but I think some things that have stuck over time are some key metrics. The first one is innovation pipeline, but the nuance is that it's measured on a certain specific value, which is in our case we chose to do that on steady state revenue. So that product or category that you're launching, when it reaches steady state revenue, what will it bring? And then as we launch things into the market, we adapted our SAP systems. I met just someone from SAP to be able to measure, what's innovation versus what's not innovation. So it's inherent in the system. We can speed reports that say, here's the revenue that is being generated by products. We can see the mix of innovation versus non-innovation against the definition.
and see how that mix is performing. So we have a goal of mix of innovation that right now is close to 20%. And
Say, what do you mean by 20%?
20% of all of the revenue generated from Whirlpool Corporation delivered by products that meet the category,
Meet your test,
meet
okay.
the definition. And then the third element is the EOP lift. So looking at against a set of categories, and if it's a new category, against the overall profitability of the company. All of these, it's aggregated through the different regional organizations and categories, cascading down into the individual performance. But I think what's really most meaningful and what we've seen people really rally upon is when these numbers are really part of the balanced scorecard and everyone feels responsible for it. That creates a notion of we are in this together. It's not about just the individual performance.
So why, again, I think that's something very few organizations have done, as I said. What was the most difficult thing about building those metrics or making them work at Whirlpool? Because I know of almost no organizations that hold every line manager responsible for innovation.
I think the most difficult thing is the battle that exists at business unit level to deliver the quarterly results, the annual results that are measured in share and profitability. So all of these other innovation metrics will sometimes be noise. And I'm not being asked to do this until this became part of the ongoing conversation, until the CEO is saying, okay, let's look at the P&L, but also look at the pipeline, and what's happening with the pipeline, and giving actions to actually improve upon the results for those innovation metrics, is that we've seen that cascade down.
So I have quite a few KitchenAid products. You'll be happy to know. There's a little advertisement. I just got this amazing their food processor that I think is the first one that you can put something through and it dices it.
Yep.
So I shred the cheese. I diced all the tomatoes. I said, "Bite me, Taco Bell!" Right? I'm a chopping god now.
Yep.
So tell me, where do the insights? How have you trained people? Because you talked about changing customer expectations. Tell me a little bit about how you've taught people, how you've trained people to think like innovators.
It's been through the adoption of a process we call the double diamond process. We've consistently, over time, trained people through it. So every time, if you're a new category manager or a marketing person, the first thing you have to be able to know is how to operate this process. It's not always led by the category manager or the person responsible for the category. That's why we have mentors and we have people that can actually do this for a living. But it's a very systematic way of going after something. So in this case, if we actually that came from an exercise where, and by the way, there's a video in the Mix article about the KitchenAid,
okay.
the KitchenAid experience. But once we tackle this exercise at a specific category level, we say, what are the types of things that we can do in the kitchen that we're not doing, and through different lenses, uncover things that we haven't uncovered before. We realize needs that we didn't see. Another example of that is the KitchenAid target is people that love to cook. So there are very premium things, but they don't have the time to do that.
Vanity kitchens.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we've created a new category. It's one of the domains that is semi-automatic cooking. And you still keep the customer engaged in the process while giving them the ability to do things and get the feeling that they are the creators of the food.
So when you teach people, so I have two questions. First, how many people over this last decade and more of journey, how many people have actually been taught how to think like a business innovator at Whirlpool? How many people have you put through? And what is the core of that curriculum? Maybe just the 2 or 3 most important things you're trying to teach them, how to think so you unlock that creative potential.
It's in the thousands. If I have to put a number, I would say maybe close to 5,000 people that have gone through this. What do they have? What is the core curriculum? Actually, when you think about this, it has really 3 phases, 3 big phases. Each one of them has a series of tools. The first one is discovery. Really being able to, before you decide you have an answer, and people many times get to a problem with feeling that they already know the answer, is forcing them to think differently and diverge and bring different perspectives. So bringing that different perspective is achieved by applying these tools with rigor. The second portion of this is the second diamond. The second divergence is, the concept creation is when, the sausage is made, and there are another set of tools that help you see if you're actually being able to drive unique consumer value, through, exploring the benefits that you're delivering and so on and so forth. At the end of that, very disciplined tools to do experimentation, short experimentation, and not wanting to have the tendency at Whirlpool to, well, we have to build a working prototype. How can we see if, dicing is actually going to help your process without having to create a working prototype in 100 days with, $5,000? Those are the key components of the process, and the key is that, we have people that know how to do it. They have a label. They are mentors. They're proud of it. They have in their desks, a designation, and they called upon when someone is trying to do something.
So this is this person you call an I mentor. So describe how many have been, is that the 5,000 that over this 10 years you've created five?
That's the group that we call certified I mentors.
Okay.
If you think about all the people that has been trained globally, we're probably in the last 10 years maybe we're in the 20,000s.
20,000. I just reflect on that for a moment. An organization that teaches 20,000 people how to think like business innovators. Because one of the things I often find, and weirdly, Moises, in the most creative companies, I find this almost the most exaggerated. There's kind of like this creative apartheid, where there's a few people who are really creative and really smart, but most people aren't capable. And it kind of reinforces like how special we are in design or how special we are. So what was it at the beginning that got Whirlpool thinking about the fact that this could be everybody's job?
Well, that's a vision really from the CEO, Dave Wilwam. And he believed that he could transform the organization into an innovation engine where innovation will come from everywhere. That was really the beginning of that. And we proved through this systematic process that we could actually change the behavior. Not everyone thinks that way. People have been trained actually in business school to try to go with an answer and be really limited in the way they look at the problems. And I think going through this process allowed the organization to establish that common language. And now what you see is something very interesting. People have adopted some of the tools and apply them even into things like career development. They can develop their career plan through a migration map and so on. So that's really the notion of that. That's Dave's heritage and something that we've been consistent with.
Now, I believe that when he started that project, and Truth in Advertising, my colleagues at Strategos were very much part of that original journey there. When he started that, what was his time frame for how long this was going to take?
Do you mean the actual training or the whole process?
Training, the process. What was his vision of how long the company, because most executives, the time frame is, maybe 9 to 12 months, and then we better be on to the next thing.
I think Dave, when this program was launched, knew that it was going to take no less than 10 years to get there, and we've seen that.
10 years.
10 years. Yeah, it's really a long time that you get to make the whole transformation. We've seen different chapters and different eras of innovation through this time, but it's really not something that happens overnight, and the consistency is really what makes the difference.
And I'm guessing that it didn't take 10 years to get a payback, but that's the time frame to make it part of the culture.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So maybe a last question, then I hope to let's take a couple from the audience, 2 or 3. I think it's often hard to, a lot of people think of innovation as this tender little flower that has to be protected, that is almost completely serendipitous. The wind blew in the seed and the moisture was there, and, let's protect this little thing. And then you have, so if you have that view, you're never going to scale it and make it a system. The other side is you treat it like Six Sigma, and everybody has the tools, and and it kind of loses the spontaneity. So how have you managed? Give us kind of a tangible example of where that tension has manifested itself. People either trying to over-systematize it or say, no, it'll just happen. Yeah. How do you manage that tension?
It's a great question. There's a big tension. It's a big tension because many times there are business priorities that the leaders, feel now it's time to ignore innovation because I have to fix the category, or I need to get into this trade partner that I lost. There's no time for innovation. The way I think about us managing that tension is through the management systems, and almost see it as a dial. And the innovation architect will look at what are the different things that we have to do to move the needle this year. And sometimes this year it's going to be all training. We have to really reinvigorate the culture, bring the language back, so on and so forth. sometimes is we got to get tighter on the metrics because the quality of what we're seeing is not enough. And this happens through conversations with the leadership team, but really looking at these from the balcony and looking at all the different elements that I mentioned and seeing where are the things that are really affecting. And all of that has to be obviously in synchrony, in harmony with the strategy and the business plans of the organization.
Okay, so a question or two from you right there by the post. Yes, please. And maybe we can find somebody else with a microphone too. So I'm afraid we're making you run a marathon, but yeah.
Hi, good afternoon.
Hello.
Vili Machuska from Red Bull. I wanted to ask you, you're mostly describing an internal innovation process. What about external processes? What about crowdsourcing? What about considering Apple, Tesla, Google as your competitors?
That is absolutely needed. I don't think we can think of being successful in innovation without doing that. The way we've incorporated that is really making sure that through the same process, these tools are enablers for the innovation activities of the company. So if you think of the discovery, we have partnerships with companies like P&G. Actually, there's a product in the market right now, recently launched, called Swash, that went through the same process, but the inputs come from different places. So it's important to do that. Then when you think about the ideation phase of the process, it's not only about people in a room. Can you bring all of those findings that you found through the discovery process into an innovation tool? We use Imaginatic at some point and really get the global input to create those migration paths. So I don't think it's either internal or external. It's really a combination, but the system is what prevails.
Yes, Frederick over here, and then we'll go right to the back of the room. Yes, please.
I'd like you to talk about one thing you haven't yet talked about, which is the why of the innovation, right? You gave the example, if I understood you right, of people having a washing machine that's broken and then also changing their dryer. And you could say, hey, that's a wonderful innovation for Whirlpool, but it's a terrible innovation for the planet, right?
Unless it gets recycled.
Maybe. And I'm sure you're innovating on reducing water consumption, electricity consumption, but the hardest question is, could you reduce the number of appliances that people need? And really asking the question of, what's the innovation good for?
Yep. Well, I think it's a choice the organization makes, and I think Whirlpool is a very socially responsible company. So I would not say that there are plenty of programs that actually leverage the innovation tools to find creative ways of recycling appliances, doing it through our trade partners and so forth. I think the question from an innovation perspective or the innovation management perspective is, where are you going to point the innovation gun? And I think in this case, we point it everywhere. Now, when we think about we want to create an innovation system, an engine that has a business purpose, it was pointed to driving this type of results. But I think when you think about, we train, thousands of employees, all of those tools and principles can be used for other purposes, like, improving the social responsibility of the company.
Okay, and then in the back, thank you. This will be our last question.
My name is Rosa from Diapraxis. Thank you so much. My question has to do with, it sounds like you've done this admirable work in terms of innovation with regard to the products that you could create. And part of that was defining this process and devising some metrics, et cetera. I'm curious, in terms of internal process work, do you consider that innovation, or does that fall under a different category and a different definition?
That's a good question. I've had that question several times before, and we think that it's still the job of innovation. A lot of the tools apply. Actually, we have combined Six Sigma tools with innovation tools to drive process results, but it manifests into different forms, like cost reduction and other things. But from a management perspective, we've chosen to drive innovation on the product side, on the external side. But definitely, I think innovation can also deliver on those other dimensions. Yep.
You know, I just leave you with two thoughts. Well, one observation from the time I spent at Whirlpool. You know, the thought is, it's always been kind of interesting to me that so many CEOs talk about innovation, but it's a little bit like my point earlier about activism. They very seldom actually teach people how to do this. Mm-hmm. And I had this analogy the other day of thinking, you know, about if you wanted somebody to be able to hit a golf ball 200 yards down the fairway, and you had every year awards for the person who could hit like the longest ball and keep it in the fairway, whatever. I mean, we'd never expect that to happen without teaching people how to hold a club and swing. But somehow we expect this innovation to happen without even, and the little anecdote here, and this goes a little bit to the question of why, Frederick, not in a cosmic sense, but in a very human sense. I remember early on as you were training people and training hourly unionized employees how to be innovators, they took over the internal space one weekend of a shopping mall close to Whirlpool's headquarters, and you had people from the manufacturing line who had the prototypes, the ideas of their products, showing these to, you know, the community, and what's your feedback and what do you think? And I walked through that and I saw, I remember one particular African-American woman, can't remember what she did on the manufacturing line, but it was probably the first time in her career anybody had ever said, A, do you have an idea? B, we will invest in your creative capital, and C, we trust you to share this and talk about it. Yep. So you could see, and her children are around her, and you know, it was a transforming moment for her. So we'll circle back to where we began by how do we unleash that human capability. So thank you very much, Moises. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.